Montana Territory, 1878. The snow fell like judgment on the barren winter landscape, transforming the rugged terrain into a blinding white void. Zeke Zimmerman pulled his scarf tighter around his face as the bitter December wind cut through his woolen coat. At 25, he'd already seen enough of the frontier's cruelties to last several lifetimes. The heavy snowfall had caught him by surprise, forcing him to seek shelter before reaching his intended destination of Clearwater Springs. His ranch could wait another day. Only a fool would press on through weather like this, and Zeke prided himself on being many things but never a fool. "Steady, Maverick," he murmured to his black stallion as they trudged through knee-deep snow. The horse snorted, its breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Zeke had built his life around a simple principle: a man stands alone in this world. The war had taught him that. 5 years since Appomattox, and still the nightmares came. His parents gone to fever, his brother lost at Gettysburg, Zeke had learned early that attachment was just an invitation for loss. The frontier was no place for tenderness. Out here, sentimentality got you killed. His ranch, the Circle Z, was all that mattered now. 20 acres of hard-won land, a small herd of cattle, and no one to answer to but himself. It wasn't much, but it was his, built with his own 2 hands. That was something a man could count on, not people, never people. The wind howled, driving needles of ice against his face. Zeke squinted through the white haze, searching for the line of cottonwoods that would indicate Willow Creek. If memory served, Old Man Jenkins had a trapper's cabin nearby. Not ideal, but it beat freezing to death in a Montana blizzard. As Maverick trudged forward, Zeke thought he glimpsed movement in the distance, a dark smudge against the relentless white. Probably a deer, he reasoned, or his eyes playing tricks. But as they drew closer, the shape resolved into something else entirely. A woman. She struggled through the snow, bent against the wind, clearly exhausted. What caught Zeke's attention wasn't just her presence, shocking enough in this weather, but what she carried. A small bundle clutched protectively against her chest. "Hello there," he called out, his voice nearly lost in the wind. The woman's head snapped up, and for a moment she looked ready to run. Even from this distance, Zeke could see the fear in her eyes. "I mean no harm," he shouted, raising his hands placatingly. "You shouldn't be out in this storm." As he approached, the details of her situation became clearer and more concerning. She was young, perhaps 22, with honey-blonde hair escaping from beneath a threadbare wool bonnet. Her coat was woefully inadequate for the weather, and her dress, once a cheerful blue, was soaked through at the hem. But it was her burden that truly shocked him, a child no more than 2 years old, wrapped in what appeared to be the woman's own shawl. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Help us." The bundle in her arms moved slightly, and Zeke saw a small face peeking out from the wrappings, cheeks flushed with cold. His immediate instinct was to ride on. Other people's troubles weren't his concern. The frontier had its own harsh justice. The unprepared didn't survive long. But something in the woman's determined stance, the protective way she held the child despite her own obvious exhaustion, made him hesitate. "There's a cabin not far," he found himself saying. "Can you make it a little further?" Relief washed over her face, but she swayed dangerously. Without thinking, Zeke dismounted and moved toward her, his boots sinking deep into the snow. "I'm Zeke Zimmerman," he said, close enough now to see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. "Let me take the child." She hesitated, clutching the bundle tighter. "You're about to fall over," he pointed out, not unkindly. "I promise I'm just trying to help." After a moment's consideration, she nodded. Eliza Hammond," she said, her voice hoarse from cold. "And this is Jacob." As she passed the child to him, their fingers brushed, and Zeke was startled by how cold her hands were. The boy was surprisingly heavy, his small face red from the cold but his eyes bright and alert. "Your son?" Zeke asked, securing the child against his chest while reaching for Maverick's reins. A shadow passed over Eliza's face. "My brother's child," she said softly. "My nephew." There was a story there, Zeke knew, but now wasn't the time. "We need to get you both warm. Can you mount?" With his assistance, Eliza managed to climb atop Maverick, and Zeke handed Jacob back up to her before taking the reins and leading the horse through the deepening snow. The cabin couldn't be more than a mile away, but in this weather every step was a battle. "Where are you headed?" he asked, needing conversation to distract from the biting cold. "Clearwater Springs," Eliza replied, her teeth chattering. "My aunt lives there." Zeke nodded. "That's my destination as well. I have a ranch outside of town." "You're the Circle Z," she said with surprising recognition. "Aunt Margaret mentioned you." You brought her a quarter of beef last winter when Uncle Thomas was laid up with his back. Zeke vaguely recalled the old couple. The woman had insisted on giving him a jar of preserved peaches in return, refusing to accept charity. The Hendersons, good people. They're all the family I have left now, Eliza said, her voice barely audible over the wind. All Jacob has left too. The implication hung in the air between them. Something had happened to the boy's parents, Eliza's brother and his wife, another tragedy in a land that seemed to breed them. After what felt like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, the dark outline of Jenkins' cabin appeared through the swirling snow. It was small but solid, built to withstand the brutal Montana winters. Wait here, Zeke instructed, helping Eliza and Jacob down from the horse. He approached the cabin cautiously, hand resting on the revolver at his hip. Jenkins was known to be away trapping for weeks at a time, but caution was second nature on the frontier. A quick inspection confirmed the cabin was empty, though not abandoned. Dry firewood was stacked neatly by the small iron stove, and basic provisions lined a crude shelf Jenkins clearly intended to return. Zeke quickly started a fire in the stove before returning for Eliza and the child. It's not much, he said, ushering them inside, but it'll keep us alive until this storm passes. The cabin's interior was simple. One room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and the blessed iron stove that was already beginning to radiate heat. Zeke busied himself with Maverick, bringing the horse around to the lean-to at the back of the cabin, where a small supply of hay would keep him fed overnight. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, Eliza had removed her wet bonnet and coat. Her honey-blonde hair fell in damp waves past her shoulders, and in the warm glow of the oil lamp, Zeke could see she was even younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 20 at most. She sat on the edge of the bed, the little boy in her lap, unwrapping him from the makeshift cocoon of her shawl. He needs dry clothes, she said worriedly, looking up as Zeke entered. Everything we have is soaked through. Zeke rummaged through his saddlebags, producing a clean flannel shirt. It'll swallow him whole, but it's dry and warm. As Eliza changed the boy, Zeke turned his attention to the stove, putting on a pot of coffee from his supplies. The domesticity of the scene struck him as profoundly foreign. For years he'd avoided entanglements of any kind, especially those involving women and children. Yet here he was, playing rescuer to a young woman and her nephew. "Thank you," Eliza said softly from behind him. "We would have died out there." Zeke turned to find her standing closer than expected, the child now bundled in his oversized shirt, sleeping peacefully on the bed. Up close, the exhaustion was plain on her face, but there was a quiet dignity in her posture, a determination that spoke of hard choices and harder journeys. "What brings you out in weather like this?" he asked, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. Clearwater Springs could have waited for clearer skies. Eliza accepted the cup gratefully, warming her hands around it before speaking. "We didn't have a choice. The money ran out at the boarding house in Helena." She glanced at the sleeping child. "Jacob needs stability, a real home. Aunt Margaret is our only hope." "And the boy's parents." A shadow crossed her face. "My brother Thomas and his wife Clara died 3 months ago, influenza." The simple statement carried the weight of immeasurable grief. "I was staying with them in Helena when it swept through." "It took them both within a week of each other." Zeke nodded, all too familiar with how quickly death could claim the unprepared on the frontier. "I'm sorry." Eliza sipped her coffee, her eyes distant. "Thomas was older than me by 10 years. He practically raised me after our parents died. When I turned 18 last spring, he insisted I come west to join them." A sad smile touched her lips. "He said Montana was the land of new beginnings." Her story resonated uncomfortably with Zeke's own past. He too knew the sting of being the last one standing, and now you're Jacob's guardian. It wasn't a question, but Eliza nodded anyway. "He has no one else. I couldn't bear to see him sent to an orphanage." Her voice cracked slightly. "Thomas would never forgive me." The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's shutters. Inside, the fire popped and hissed in the stove, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Zeke found himself studying Eliza's profile as she watched the sleeping child. There was something both fragile and indomitable about her, like a wildflower that somehow blooms through a crack in solid rock. "You should rest," he said, suddenly aware he'd been staring. "Take the bed with the boy." "I'll make do by the stove." Eliza looked as though she might argue, but exhaustion won out. "Just for a little while," she agreed. "Wake me in a few hours so you can have a turn." Zeke doubted he'd sleep much anyway. Years of vigilance had trained him to rest lightly, especially in unfamiliar surroundings. As Eliza settled beside her nephew, Zeke added wood to the stove and settled into one of the chairs, his back to the wall where he could watch both the door and the window. Despite his intention to remain alert, the warmth of the cabin and the rhythmic breathing of his unexpected companions lulled Zeke into a light doze. He dreamed of snow and voices calling his name, of battles long past and faces he'd tried to forget. He woke with a start to the sound of whimpering. For a moment disoriented, he reached for his gun before remembering where he was. The oil lamp had burned low, but in its dim light he could see the small boy, Jacob, sitting up on the bed, tears streaming down his round face. Beside him, Eliza slept deeply, the exhaustion of their ordeal evident in the way she hadn't stirred at the child's distress. Zeke hesitated. He knew nothing about children, had actively avoided them for most of his adult life. But the boy's quiet sobs tugged at something long buried. "Hey there, partner," he said softly, moving to sit on the edge of the bed. "What's troubling you?" Jacob looked up, his small face scrunched in misery. "Mama," he whimpered. The simple word carried a world of loss that Zeke understood all too well. Without thinking, he reached out and awkwardly patted the boy's back. "I know, little man, I know." To his surprise, Jacob crawled into his lap, tiny hands clutching at his shirt. Zeke froze, uncertain what to do, before slowly, carefully, wrapping his arms around the small, warm body. The child's sobs gradually subsided to hiccups, then to the deep, even breathing of sleep. Something shifted in Zeke's chest as he held the sleeping boy, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart after the war. He found himself remembering his own childhood, the comfort of his mother's arms, the strength of his father's hand on his shoulder. Family, connection, all the things he'd convinced himself he neither needed nor deserved. Carefully, so as not to wake either of his charges, Zeke laid Jacob back beside Eliza. The boy immediately curled against his aunt, seeking her familiar warmth even in sleep. As Zeke returned to his chair, he found himself watching them both, wondering at the strange turn his journey had taken. Morning brought weak sunlight filtering through the cabin's small window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Zeke had risen early, checking on Maverick and assessing the conditions outside. The snow was deep but navigable. With an early start, they could reach Clearwater Springs by nightfall. When he returned to the cabin, he found Eliza awake, her hair neatly braided, attempting to heat water for coffee on the stove. "Good morning," she said, a tentative smile warming her features. "I hope we didn't disrupt your rest too badly." "Not at all," Zeke replied, hanging his coat by the door. "The boy had a rough night, though." Concern flashed across Eliza's face. "Was he crying? I usually wake when he does." "Just a bit, nothing serious." Zeke moved to help with the coffee, his larger hands easily managing the hot pot that Eliza had been struggling with. "You were exhausted," he settled quickly enough. Their fingers brushed as he handed her a cup of coffee, and Zeke was struck by how different her hands felt now, warm and alive, unlike the icy touch from yesterday. The observation unsettled him. "The storm's past," he said, putting distance between them. "If we leave within the hour, we can reach town by sunset." Eliza nodded, her face falling slightly at his brusque tone. "Of course. We've imposed on your kindness long enough." Jacob chose that moment to wake, his cheerful babbling a stark contrast to the suddenly tense atmosphere. The boy seemed to have no memory of his midnight sorrow, greeting the morning and Zeke with equal enthusiasm. "Up," he demanded, arms outstretched toward the cowboy. Before Zeke could react, Eliza intervened. "No, Jacob, Mr. Zimmerman is busy. Come have some breakfast." The disappointment on the boy's face was comical, his lower lip thrust out in a perfect pout. Despite himself, Zeke felt a smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe later, partner," he found himself saying, "after breakfast." Eliza looked surprised but pleased by the exchange, and Zeke felt oddly self-conscious under her gaze. To distract himself, he busied himself with preparations for their departure, checking his gear and Maverick's saddle while Eliza fed Jacob and packed their few belongings. Within the hour, they were ready to depart. The journey would be challenging. Maverick could carry Eliza and Jacob both, but Zeke would need to walk, leading the horse through the deep snow. It would be slow going. As Zeke helped Eliza mount, with Jacob securely in her arms, he was struck again by how young she was to be shouldering such responsibility. Most girls her age were still dreaming of beaux and dances, not raising an orphaned child on the unforgiving frontier. "You're staring, mister." Zimmerman, Eliza observed, a hint of amusement in her voice. Zeke cleared his throat, embarrassed to be caught. Just wondering how you ended up out here alone, he said gruffly. It's not safe for a woman and child. Eliza's expression sobered. We didn't start out alone. I hired a man in Helena to drive us to Clearwater Springs, a freight hauler with a wagon. But 3 days into the journey she hesitated, glancing at Jacob. He made certain suggestions about how I might pay for our passage. When I refused, he left us at a way station with our bags. Anger flashed through Zeke, hot and unexpected. What was his name? It doesn't matter now, Eliza said, shaking her head. I managed to arrange a ride with another family heading this direction, but their wagon broke an axle yesterday morning. They decided to wait out the storm at the way station, but I knew Aunt Margaret would be worried sick. The station master said Clearwater Springs was only 5 miles east, and the weather seemed clear enough. She trailed off, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I misjudged how quickly the storm would move in. A common mistake out here, Zeke said, more gently than he'd intended, even for those of us who know better. They set off through the glistening landscape, the sun turning the snow into a field of diamonds. Despite the difficult conditions, they made steady progress. Jacob chattered happily from his perch in front of Eliza, pointing at tracks in the snow and calling out to birds overhead. His innocent wonder was infectious, and Zeke found himself smiling more than he had in years. At midday, they stopped to rest beside a frozen stream. Zeke shared his provisions, jerky, hardtack, and the last of his coffee. As they ate, Jacob wandered the small clearing under Eliza's watchful eye, discovering the joy of making footprints in pristine snow. He seems remarkably resilient, Zeke observed, watching the boy's antics. Eliza nodded, a complicated mix of emotions crossing her face. Children are, I think, more than adults sometimes. He asks for his parents still, but less often now. She paused, watching Jacob attempt to make a snowball with mittened hands. I worry that he'll forget them entirely. He's so young. You'll keep their memory alive for him, Zeke said with unexpected conviction. Tell him stories, show him pictures if you have them. I have a daguerreotype, Eliza confirmed. Thomas and Clara on their wedding day. It's not much, but it's something, Zeke finished for her, something real to hold on to. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Zeke felt uncomfortably exposed, as though she could see past his carefully constructed barriers to the broken parts he'd spent years concealing. What about you, Mr. Zimmerman? Eliza asked softly. Do you have family waiting in Clearwater Springs? No, he replied, perhaps too quickly. Just the ranch, and please call me Zeke, after sharing a cabin, Mr. Zimmerman seems overly formal. Zeke, she repeated, and something about the way his name sounded in her voice made his chest tighten strangely. And you work your ranch alone. I hire help during calving and branding, he explained. But otherwise, yes, I prefer it that way. Eliza studied him thoughtfully. That sounds lonely. I prefer to think of it as peaceful, Zeke countered, uncomfortable with her perception. No one to answer to but myself. No one to care for but yourself either, she observed without judgment. No one depending on you. Before Zeke could formulate a response, Jacob came running back, his cheeks rosy with cold and exertion. Aunt Liza, dear, he exclaimed, pointing excitedly toward the tree line. Sure enough, a young doe stood watching them curiously from the edge of the clearing. For a breathless moment, the tableau held the innocent wonder of the child, the graceful vigilance of the deer. Then the doe bounded away, white tail flashing. Time to move on, Zeke said, rising to his feet and brushing snow from his pants. We've still got a ways to go. As they continued their journey, Zeke found himself mulling over Eliza's words. He'd never framed his solitary existence as an escape from responsibility before, but her perspective nagged at him. Was that what he'd been doing all these years, avoiding connections to avoid the pain of loss, but also the burden of care? The afternoon wore on, the sun sliding toward the western horizon. Jacob eventually fell asleep against Eliza, the excitement and cold finally overwhelming his boundless energy. Zeke took the opportunity to ask about their plans. How long will you stay with your aunt and uncle? Eliza adjusted her hold on the sleeping child before answering. I'm not sure. Uncle Thomas wrote that they have a small house, but they've offered to let us stay as long as needed. I've been working as a seamstress since I was 16. I'm hoping to find similar work in Clearwater Springs. The town's growing, Zeke acknowledged. There might be opportunity there, the mercantile owner's wife, Mrs. Patterson handles most of the tailoring work currently, but I've heard her complaining about the load. You don't seem like the type to pay attention to town gossip, Eliza observed with a small smile. Zeke felt his ears warming and was grateful for the cover of his hat. You notice things when you're quiet, he said simply. People talk around you, not to you. Is that why you stay quiet? To listen or to keep people at a distance? The question was too perceptive by half, and Zeke chose to ignore it, pointing instead to a rise in the distance. Once we crest that hill, we'll see the town. Not far now. They trudged on in silence, the only sounds the crunch of snow beneath their feet and Maverick's occasional snort. As they reached the top of the rise, the valley opened before them, revealing the scattered buildings of Clearwater Springs nestled along the banks of the frozen creek that gave the town its name. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance they could make out people moving about their business. We made it, Eliza breathed, relief evident in her voice. She gently roused Jacob, who blinked sleepily at the view. Look, sweetheart, there's our new home. The descent into town was easier, the trail more traveled and packed down. As they approached the outskirts, Zeke felt a familiar tension creeping into his shoulders. He'd purposely built his ranch far enough from town to avoid regular interaction, visiting only when supplies necessitated it. Now, guiding a young woman and child down the main street, he felt uncomfortably conspicuous. Curious gazes followed their progress, and Zeke could almost hear the speculation that would race through town by morning. The reclusive rancher from the Circle Z, arriving with a beautiful young woman and child in tow, it was the kind of gossip that would feed conversation for weeks in a place this size. Where does your aunt live? He asked, ignoring the stares. On Pine Street near the church, Eliza replied, looking around with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Number 14, she wrote. They made their way through town, passing the general store, the saloon, and the small sheriff's office before turning onto Pine Street. Number 14 proved to be a modest but well-maintained clapboard house with green shutters and a small front porch. Smoke curled from the chimney and warm light glowed from the windows against the gathering dusk. As they approached the gate, the front door swung open, and an older woman rushed out, her gray hair escaping from its pins, a shawl hastily thrown over her shoulders. Eliza, oh thank heavens! Margaret Henderson hurried down the path, unmindful of the snow. We've been sick with worry. Thomas rode to the way station yesterday when you didn't arrive, but they said you'd left hours before the storm hit. Eliza slid from Maverick's back with Jacob in her arms, meeting her aunt in a tearful embrace. We got caught in the blizzard, she explained. If not for Mr. Zimmerman here, we wouldn't have survived. Margaret turned her attention to Zeke, recognition dawning. The rancher from Circle Z, she stepped forward, grasping his hand with surprising strength. You've saved our girls, Mr. Zimmerman. How can we ever repay you? Uncomfortable with the gratitude, Zeke shook his head. No need, ma'am. Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone, Margaret disagreed firmly. Not out here. Thomas, she called back toward the house, come out here. An older man appeared in the doorway, his weathered face lighting up at the sight of his niece and grandnephew. He hurried down to join them, embracing Eliza before turning to shake Zeke's hand vigorously. Come inside, all of you, Margaret insisted. Dinner's nearly ready and you must be frozen through. Zeke took a step back, suddenly eager to escape the unfamiliar warmth of family reunion. Thank you, ma'am, but I should be getting back to my ranch. My foreman will be wondering what's become of me. Eliza looked up from where she'd been introducing Jacob to his gray tuncle, disappointment flashing briefly across her face. At least stay for a hot meal, she urged, after everything you've done for us. Zeke hesitated, caught between his instinct to retreat and the genuine invitation in Eliza's eyes. Behind her, Jacob wiggled free from Thomas's embrace and toddled over to tug at Zeke's pant leg. Stay, the boy commanded, with all the authority his 2 years could muster. A laugh escaped Zeke before he could stop it. Well, when you put it that way. The Henderson home was modest but comfortable, filled with the kind of personal touches that spoke of a life well lived. Handmade quilts draped over chairs, pressed flowers framed on walls, shelves lined with books and mementos. It was everything Zeke's Spartan cabin was not. Dinner was a simple but hearty affair, venison stew, fresh bread, and preserved peaches for dessert. The conversation flowed easily around him, with Eliza recounting their journey and Margaret fussing over Jacob's healthy appetite. Thomas Henderson proved to be a thoughtful man of few words, much like Zeke himself, and they shared a silent understanding across the table. As the meal concluded, Thomas cleared his throat. "We're grateful beyond words, Zimmerman. Not just for bringing our girl safely to us, but for what you did last winter too. That quarter of beef saw us through some lean months." Zeke shifted uncomfortably under the genuine gratitude. "It was nothing, sir." "It was everything," Thomas corrected firmly, "and now this seems we're forever in your debt." "The debt is mine," Zeke said suddenly, surprising even himself. "Your niece reminded me of something I'd forgotten." He glanced at Eliza, who was watching him with curious eyes. "That there are things worth protecting in this world beyond property and livestock." A thoughtful silence fell over the table, broken only by Jacob's contented humming as he played with a wooden spoon Margaret had given him. "Well," Margaret said finally, rising from her seat, "Jacob needs his bath before bed, and I'm sure you all could use some rest after your ordeal." She fixed Zeke with a maternal gaze. "You're welcome to our spare room for the night, Mr. Zimmerman. No sense riding back to your ranch in the dark." Again, Zeke's instinct was to decline, to retreat to the solitude he knew. But the thought of his cold, empty cabin held less appeal than usual. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, that's very kind." Later, as the household settled for the night, Zeke found himself on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. The door opened behind him and Eliza stepped out, wrapped in a borrowed shawl. "Jacob's finally asleep," she said, moving to stand beside him at the railing. "He was so excited by all the new faces I wasn't sure he'd ever settle." "He's a good boy," Zeke observed. "Smart, too." "Yes," pride warmed Eliza's voice. "He's the image of my brother at that age, same curious spirit." She paused, studying Zeke's profile in the moonlight. "You were good with him, you know." "Most men wouldn't have the patience." Zeke shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Children are straightforward. They say what they mean, want what they want. It's adults who complicate things." "Is that why you live alone?" Eliza asked, her voice gentle but direct. "To avoid complication." For a moment, Zeke considered deflecting the question as he had earlier. But something about the quiet night and Eliza's genuine interest broke through his usual reticence. "After the war," he began slowly, "I came west because there was nothing left for me back home. Parents gone, brother buried at Gettysburg, farm foreclosed. The familiar pain of these memories had dulled over time to a manageable ache. I learned that attachments are temporary. Everything you love can be taken in an instant." "So you decided not to love anything?" Eliza asked, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "I decided to love things that couldn't be easily destroyed," Zeke corrected. "Land, work, the satisfaction of building something with my own hands." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains where his ranch lay. "The Circle Z isn't much, but it's solid, dependable." "Unlike people," Eliza surmised softly. "Unlike people," he agreed. Eliza was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "I understand the temptation," she finally said. "After losing Thomas and Clara, there were days I wanted to wall myself off completely. But then I look at Jacob," she smiled, a bittersweet expression. "Loving him is terrifying. Every fever, every stumble, my heart stops. But I can't imagine a life where I didn't take that risk." Her words settled over Zeke like a challenge. Was she right? Had he been avoiding pain at the cost of something greater? "I should check on Maverick," he said, suddenly needing space from the uncomfortable introspection. "Make sure he's settled for the night." "Of course," Eliza said, stepping back. "Good night, Zeke. And thank you again for everything." As she turned to go inside, Zeke found himself speaking without thinking. "I'll come by tomorrow, before I head back to the ranch." At her surprised look, he added hastily, "to make sure you and Jacob are settling and all right." A smile bloomed across Eliza's face, transforming her features in the moonlight. "We'd like that," she said simply before disappearing inside. Alone on the porch, Zeke wondered what had possessed him to make such an offer. He'd done his duty, brought them safely to town. There was no need for further involvement. Yet the thought of riding away tomorrow without seeing Jacob's gap-toothed smile once more, without hearing Eliza's thoughtful observations, left him unexpectedly hollow. True to his word, Zeke returned the next morning. He told himself it was simply to check that Eliza and Jacob had everything they needed, that his responsibility as their rescuer extended this far and no further. But the warmth that spread through his chest when Jacob spotted him from the front window and came running to the door gave lie to his rationalization. "Zeke," the boy cried, flinging himself at the cowboy's legs. "Whoa there, partner," Zeke laughed, swinging the child up into his arms with an ease that surprised him. "You're in fine spirits this morning." Jacob, let poor Mr. Zimmerman breathe, Margaret chided gently, appearing behind the boy with a dish towel in hand. Come in, we're just finishing breakfast. The Henderson household was already in full swing, despite the early hour. Thomas sat at the table with a cup of coffee, reading a week-old newspaper from Helena. Eliza was at the stove, her blonde hair tied back neatly, tending to a skillet of frying potatoes. The domestic scene struck Zeke as both foreign and oddly appealing. "Good morning," Eliza greeted him with a smile. "We weren't sure you'd come by so early." "I need to head back to the ranch," Zeke explained, setting Jacob down but unable to dislodge the boy from his leg. "My foreman Davies is capable enough, but there's work that needs doing before the next snow." "Not before you've had a proper breakfast," Margaret insisted, taking his hat and coat without room for argument. Zeke found himself ushered to the table, a steaming plate of eggs and potatoes placed before him. Jacob climbed into the chair beside him, chattering about the cat he discovered in the barn behind the house and the promise of a sleigh ride Thomas had made for later that day. As they ate, Thomas folded his newspaper and fixed Zeke with a thoughtful gaze. "I was just reading about a new railroad spur they're planning to build through Buffalo Springs," he said, "only 20 miles from here. Could change things for ranchers like yourself, having a shipping point that close." The conversation turned to cattle prices and grazing rights, the kind of practical matters Zeke was comfortable discussing. Eliza listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that revealed a sharp mind and practical outlook Zeke hadn't fully appreciated before. "My brother was in the cattle business briefly," she explained when Zeke expressed surprise at her knowledge. "Before he took the job with the mining company in Helena. He used to say that understanding livestock markets was as important as understanding the animals themselves." "Your brother was a wise man," Zeke acknowledged. "He would have liked you," Eliza said with quiet certainty. "He valued straightforwardness above all else." The simple statement shouldn't have affected Zeke as it did, but the idea of being approved of by this woman's family, by the brother who had meant so much to her, stirred something unexpected within him. After breakfast, as Zeke prepared to depart, Eliza walked him to the gate where Maverick waited patiently. "Will we see you in town again soon?" she asked, her tone carefully casual. Zeke busied himself checking Maverick's saddle straps. "I don't come to town often," he admitted, "usually only for supplies once a month." Oh, the disappointment in her voice was unmistakable, though she tried to hide it. "Well, we're very grateful for all you've done." Zeke turned to face her, struck again by the quiet dignity in her bearing. She was young, yes, but there was nothing childish about the woman who had carried her nephew through a blizzard to secure his future. "The Christmas social is next week," he found himself saying. "At the church I don't usually attend, but," he trailed off uncharacteristically uncertain. "But," Eliza prompted, a hopeful note entering her voice. "But I thought I might make an exception this year," Zeke finished, surprised by his own words. "Would you, that is, would you and Jacob like to attend, as my guests?" The smile that illuminated Eliza's face was worth every moment of discomfort the question had cost him. "We would be delighted," she said simply. As Zeke rode back to his ranch, the landscape stretching white and pristine before him, he found himself thinking not of the work awaiting him, nor of the solitude he usually craved, but of honey-blonde hair and thoughtful hazel eyes, of a small boy's trusting hand in his own, and of possibilities he'd long since dismissed as not for the likes of him. For the first time in years, the future seemed to hold more than mere survival. It held promise. The days leading up to the Christmas social passed in a blur of activity for Zeke. Winter work on the ranch kept him busy from sunrise to sunset, mending fences damaged by snowfall, checking on the cattle clustered in the sheltered valleys, ensuring the stock tanks didn't freeze over. But for all the physical demands, his mind kept returning to Eliza and Jacob. 3 times he nearly saddled Maverick to ride into town on some manufactured errand, and 3 times he talked himself out of it. What would he say? What excuse could he possibly offer for his presence at their door? Better to wait for the social, where their meeting would have context, purpose. The evening before the social, Davies, his weathered foreman of 5 years, caught him polishing his seldom-used dress boots by the fire. "Planning on impressing someone tomorrow night, boss?" the older man asked with poorly concealed amusement. Zeke felt heat rise to his face. "Just maintaining my property, Davies." "Uh-huh," Davies leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "And I suppose you've been trimming that beard and pressing your good shirt for the same reason." Zeke shot him a warning glance. Don't you have somewhere to be? Nope, Davies replied cheerfully. But I did hear some interesting gossip in town yesterday when I picked up those supplies. At Zeke's reluctant look of inquiry, he continued, seems the whole town's talking about the handsome rancher who rescued the pretty young widow and her child from certain death in the blizzard. Eliza's not a widow, Zeke corrected automatically, then cursed himself for taking the bait. She's the child's aunt. Her brother and his wife passed away. Ah, so it's Eliza now, is it? Davy's weathered face split into a knowing grin. Well, that makes more sense. Folks were wondering how a widow came to be traveling alone with a child. Some of the gossip was getting a bit creative. Anger flashed through Zeke. What kind of gossip? Davies raised his hands placatingly. Nothing that'll stick now that the truth is known. Margaret Henderson set most of it straight at the Ladies' Aid Society meeting. He paused, studying Zeke with unexpected seriousness. She's a fine young woman, by all accounts. The way she stepped up for that boy, taking him on when she's barely more than a girl herself, speaks to her character. Zeke grunted noncommittally, returning his attention to his boots. Been a long time since you showed interest in anyone, Davies observed quietly. I haven't said I'm interested, Zeke pointed out stiffly. No, Davies agreed, pushing away from the doorframe, you haven't. But those boots are shinier than they've been since you bought them, and I haven't seen you this nervous since we faced down those rustlers 2 springs back. His voice softened. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, you know. Having someone to come home to. Long after Davies had gone, Zeke sat by the fire, turning the man's words over in his mind. Was he interested in Eliza Hammond? The question seemed both absurdly simple and impossibly complex. Yes, he was drawn to her quiet strength, her devotion to her nephew, the way her smile transformed her entire face. But his life was here, on the ranch, deliberately constructed to need no one and nothing beyond what he could provide for himself. To allow someone else in, a woman, a child, would be to upend everything he'd built, to risk the controlled existence that had been his salvation after the war. Yet the thought of returning to that existence, of never again seeing Jacob's gap-toothed smile or hearing Eliza's thoughtful observations, left an unexpected hollowness in his chest. The next evening, Zeke arrived at the church hall precisely at 7, dressed in his best clothes, pressed black pants, a crisp white shirt, and a dark blue vest that Davy's wife had insisted brought out his eyes when she'd gifted it to him last Christmas. His dark hair was neatly combed, his beard trimmed closer than usual. He'd even polished the silver buckle on his belt, a nervous habit he hadn't indulged since courting days long past. The hall was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, oil lamps casting a warm glow over the gathering. Nearly everyone in Clearwater Springs had turned out for the social, the community's biggest event of the season. Zeke nodded to acquaintances as he made his way through the crowd, accepting a cup of punch from Mrs. Patterson at the refreshment table. "Good evening, Mr. Zimmerman," the mercantile owner's wife greeted him warmly. "What a pleasant surprise to see you here this year." "Mrs. Patterson," he acknowledged with a slight bow, "the decorations are very fine." "Why, thank you," she preened. "We've had extra help this year. That new girl, Eliza Hammond, has quite the eye for detail. Such a tragic story, but she's bearing up remarkably well." Mrs. Patterson leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I hear you were quite the hero, rescuing her and the child from the blizzard." Zeke shifted uncomfortably, just happened to be in the right place. "Providence, I'd call it," Mrs. Patterson declared. "She's over by the piano with her aunt if you're looking for her." The knowing twinkle in the woman's eye made it clear she'd noted his frequent glances toward the door. With a nod of thanks that he hoped concealed his embarrassment, Zeke made his way across the room. The crowd parted momentarily, and suddenly there she was. Eliza stood near the piano where several children were singing carols, her honey-blonde hair arranged in an elegant twist that accentuated the graceful line of her neck. She wore a simple but becoming dress of deep blue, modest yet flattering to her slender figure. At 20, she was by far the youngest adult woman in the room, yet there was a quiet poise to her bearing that set her apart. As though sensing his gaze, Eliza turned, her face lighting up with a smile that made Zeke's carefully rehearsed greeting disappear from his mind. "You came," she said, moving toward him with Jacob trailing behind her, the boy resplendent in what appeared to be new clothes, dark pants, and a white shirt with a miniature bow tie. "I said I would," Zeke replied, finding his voice. "You look," he searched for an appropriate word that wouldn't reveal too much of his admiration, "well." A blush colored Eliza's cheeks. Thank you. So do you. Jacob had spotted him now and came barreling forward, colliding with Zeke's legs with his customary enthusiasm. Up. Before Eliza could intervene, Zeke had swung the boy into his arms. Evening partner. That's quite the fancy outfit you've got there. Aunt Lisa made it, Jacob announced proudly, for Christmas. Did she now? Zeke looked to Eliza with new appreciation. You're a woman of many talents, Miss Hammond. I told you I was a seamstress, she reminded him, but pleasure at the compliment was evident in her voice. Mrs. Patterson has already hired me to help with alterations at the mercantile. It's not much, but it's a start. That's wonderful news, Zeke said sincerely. You're settling in well then. Yes, thanks to Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas, and to you. Eliza's gaze was direct, grateful. We wouldn't be here at all if not for you, Zeke. The use of his given name, spoken with such warmth, sent an unexpected thrill through him. Before he could respond, the music changed, and couples began moving to the center of the hall for a waltz. Would you care to dance? Zeke found himself asking, surprising them both. Eliza glanced at Jacob, hesitation crossing her features. I should watch Jacob. Nonsense, Margaret Henderson appeared beside them, hands outstretched to her grandnephew. This little man and I have a date with the cookie table. You young people enjoy yourselves. With Jacob happily transferred to his great-aunt's care, Zeke offered his arm to Eliza, leading her to the dance floor with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. It had been years since he'd danced with anyone, yet his body remembered the steps as he took Eliza in his arms, keeping a respectable distance between them. I didn't know you danced, Eliza commented as they moved among the other couples. Poorly, Zeke admitted with a self-deprecating smile. My mother insisted all her sons learn, said it was the mark of a gentleman. She taught you well, Eliza observed, following his lead effortlessly. Was your family from the East? Virginia, Zeke confirmed, small farm near Richmond, nothing grand but it was home. The memories weren't as painful as they once had been. My father grew tobacco mainly. A little corn. And you came west after the war? Eliza asked gently. Zeke nodded, guiding her through a turn. Not much left for me there, seemed like a good time for a fresh start. That's what Thomas said when he wrote asking me to join them in Helena, Eliza said, her voice softening at the mention of her brother. A fresh start away from the memories. Were you very young when your parents passed? Zeke asked, genuinely curious about her history now. 12, Eliza answered. Cholera took them both within days of each other. Thomas was 22 and already married to Clara. They took me in without hesitation. A shadow crossed her face. I owe them everything, especially now with Jacob. You're honoring them by caring for him, Zeke said with conviction. They'd be proud of you, Eliza. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was genuine. Thank you for saying that. The dance ended too soon, and Zeke reluctantly released her as the music changed to a livelier tune. They made their way to the refreshment table, where Jacob was holding court among the other children, his face smeared with cookie crumbs. The evening passed in a pleasant blur. Zeke found himself drawn into conversations he would normally have avoided, introduced to neighbors he'd scarcely acknowledged before. Eliza's easy charm seemed to extend to him by proximity, and he discovered, to his surprise, that he was enjoying himself. As the social wound down, with families gathering their sleepy children and bidding farewells, Zeke offered to see Eliza and Jacob home. That would be lovely, she accepted, helping Jacob into his coat. Margaret and Thomas left an hour ago. Jacob was having such a good time, I didn't have the heart to make him leave early. The night was clear and cold, stars blazing overhead as they walked the short distance to the Henderson home. Jacob, exhausted from the excitement, rode on Zeke's shoulders, his small hands clutching Zeke's hat for balance. He's becoming quite attached to you, Eliza observed, watching the two with a soft expression. The feeling's mutual, Zeke admitted, surprised by how true the words were. He's a fine boy. They reached the gate of the Henderson home too soon. Zeke carefully lifted Jacob down, but the boy was nearly asleep on his feet, swaying with exhaustion. Come on, sweetheart, Eliza murmured, lifting him into her arms. Time for bed. I'll see you to the door, Zeke offered, following them up the path. On the porch, Eliza turned to face him, Jacob's head resting heavily on her shoulder. Thank you for inviting us tonight, she said softly. It was the loveliest evening I've had in a very long time. For me as well, Zeke said, meaning it. In the soft glow of the porch lamp, Eliza looked impossibly beautiful, her eyes reflecting the starlight, a few strands of honey-blonde hair having escaped their pins to frame her face. "When will you come to town again?" she asked, the directness of the question belying a vulnerability that touched him. "Soon," Zeke promised, "very soon." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Zeke felt the walls he'd built around his heart crumbling further. Before he could think better of it, he leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Good night, Eliza," he said softly, stepping back. Her free hand rose to touch the spot where his lips had been, a blush spreading across her cheeks. "Good night, Zeke." As he walked back to where he'd left his horse tethered near the church, Zeke's mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions. The evening had shifted something fundamental within him, awakened possibilities he'd long since dismissed. The thought of returning to his solitary existence at the ranch no longer held the appeal it once had. For the first time in years, Zeke Zimmerman was considering a future that included more than just survival. The weeks following the Christmas social brought changes to Clearwater Springs and to Zeke's carefully ordered life. True to his word, he found himself riding into town with increasing frequency, his excuses growing thinner with each visit. He needed supplies, he wanted to check on a pending order of feed. He had business with the bank. Each pretense transparent, each journey rewarded with Eliza's welcoming smile and Jacob's enthusiastic greetings. January brought bitter cold but clear skies, perfect for the sleigh rides Thomas had promised Jacob. Zeke found himself invited along, his larger, stronger draft horses better suited to pulling the old sleigh through deep snow than Thomas's aging team. The boys' delight as they glided across the white landscape, bells jingling merrily, was infectious. Even Thomas, usually reserved, laughed openly at Jacob's excitement. He needed this, Eliza confided to Zeke as they watched Jacob and Thomas building a snowman in the yard after one such outing. A male figure in his life. Uncle Thomas is wonderful, but he's not young anymore. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Zeke was becoming something to Jacob and to Eliza that went beyond mere friendship or obligation. February brought thaws and freezes in unpredictable cycles, making travel between the ranch and town treacherous at times. Still, Zeke made the journey whenever weather permitted, sometimes staying for dinner, sometimes just long enough to deliver a book he thought Eliza might enjoy or a small carved wooden horse for Jacob. Margaret Henderson watched these developments with knowing eyes, offering Zeke gentle encouragement in the form of favorite meals when he visited and subtle absences that left him and Eliza alone to talk by the fire after Jacob had been put to bed. It was during one such evening, with March winds howling outside and a comfortable silence between them as they sat reading in the Henderson parlor, that Eliza finally broached the subject they'd been dancing around for weeks. "Zeke," she began, setting aside her book, "may I ask you something?" He looked up from his own reading, a treatise on cattle breeding he'd been only half focused on. "Of course." "These visits," she said carefully, "what do they mean to you?" The directness of the question shouldn't have surprised him. Eliza had never been one to hedge or dissemble, but Zeke found himself momentarily at a loss for words. What did these visits mean? Everything, he realized. They had become the center around which his days revolved, the bright spots in an otherwise solitary existence. "They mean," he began slowly, choosing his words with care, "that I've come to care for you, and for Jacob." The admission was both terrifying and liberating, more than I thought possible. Eliza's expression softened, relief and something warmer lighting her eyes. "I've come to care for you too," she admitted, "very much." "I'm not an easy man, Eliza," Zeke warned, needing her to understand. "I've been alone a long time, set in my ways." "I've noticed," she said with a small smile. "You take your coffee black, you always check your saddle twice before mounting, you keep to the right side of any trail, you never begin a meal before everyone is served." Her observations, so detailed and accurate, caught him off guard. "But I've also noticed how gentle you are with Jacob, how you listen when I speak, really listen, and how you've never once treated me as less capable because I'm young or female." Her perception humbled him. "You see a great deal." "I see you, Zeke Zimmerman," Eliza said simply, "not just the parts you choose to show the world but the man beneath." The vulnerability of being so thoroughly known should have terrified him. Instead, Zeke felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, the exhaustion of maintaining walls that had, perhaps, outlived their purpose. "Where does this leave us?" he asked, venturing into unfamiliar territory. Eliza considered the question thoughtfully. That depends on what you want, I suppose. What did he want? The question had seemed so simple once. Land, security, independence. But now, looking at the woman across from him, Zeke realized his wants had expanded, grown more complex and infinitely more precious. I want to court you properly, he said finally. If you'll allow it. The smile that bloomed across Eliza's face was answer enough, but she gave him words as well. I would like that very much. Spring arrived with its customary chaos of mud and melting snow, turning the roads between the ranch and town into nearly impassable quagmires. Zeke's visits became necessarily less frequent, the demands of calving season keeping him tied to the Circle Z for days at a stretch. Still, he made time whenever possible, sometimes arriving at the Henderson home mud-splattered and exhausted, but unwilling to let too many days pass without seeing Eliza and Jacob. Their courtship progressed with a deliberate pace that respected both Eliza's youth and Zeke's cautious nature. Chaperoned walks through town, Sunday dinners with the Hendersons, carefully worded letters exchanged when weather prevented visits. Each interaction deepened their understanding of each other, their connection growing stronger with every shared confidence. Zeke found himself opening up about his past in ways he never had before, about the brother he'd lost at Gettysburg, about the farm that had been his childhood home, about the nightmares that still occasionally plagued him from his war years. Eliza listened without judgment, offering comfort not through empty platitudes but through genuine understanding. In turn, she shared her fears and hopes, her determination to give Jacob the stable home her brother would have wanted for him, her dreams of perhaps one day expanding her seamstress work into a proper dressmaking shop, her lingering guilt that she hadn't somehow been able to save Thomas and Clara from the influenza that claimed them. You couldn't have prevented it, Zeke told her gently after one such confession. Some things are beyond our power to change, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. I know that, Eliza acknowledged, her hands busying themselves with the mending in her lap. Logically I know, but here, she pressed a hand to her heart, I still wonder if I could have done more. That's because you care deeply, Zeke observed. It's one of the things I admire most about you. Their courtship did not go unnoticed in the small community of Clearwater Springs. Mrs. Patterson made a point of mentioning to Eliza how Mr. Zimmerman's orders at the mercantile had expanded to include items he'd never purchased before, ribbons for Jacob, a book of poetry, fine paper for letter writing. The bank manager commented to Zeke that property values near town were increasing, should he ever consider relocating from his remote ranch. Even Sheriff Miller, a taciturn man not given to gossip, went out of his way to tell Zeke that Miss Hammond seems to have brought out a side of you none of us knew existed. The attention might once have driven Zeke back into isolation, but now he found he minded less than expected. There was a certain pride in being seen with Eliza, in having the community recognize what was growing between them. It was late April, with the worst of the spring mud finally beginning to dry, when the first complication arose in their courtship. Zeke arrived at the Henderson home one Sunday afternoon to find an unfamiliar horse tethered outside and tension evident in Margaret's greeting. "We have a visitor," she said quietly as she took his hat. "A Mr. Reynolds from Helena. He claims to be an associate of Thomas's from the mining company." Zeke followed her into the parlor, where Eliza sat stiffly on the edge of the settee, Jacob clutched protectively in her lap. Across from her, a well-dressed man of perhaps 40 rose at Zeke's entrance. "Mr. Zimmerman," Thomas Henderson performed the introduction with obvious reluctance. "This is Mr. Howard Reynolds of the Blackwater Mining Company." The man extended his hand, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "A pleasure, sir. I've just been explaining my business to Miss Hammond and her family." Zeke shook the offered hand briefly, noting the uncalloused palm and manicured nails. Not a man who worked with his hands, and what business might that be? Reynolds glanced at Eliza, who had gone notably pale. Perhaps Miss Hammond would prefer to explain in private. "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of Mr. Zimmerman," Eliza stated firmly, though Zeke could see the slight tremor in her hands as she stroked Jacob's hair. Reynolds shrugged, resuming his seat. "As you wish. As I was explaining, the matter concerns young Jacob here." His gaze settled on the child with an assessing look that raised Zeke's hackles. "It seems there may have been some confusion regarding his guardianship after the unfortunate passing of Thomas and Clara Hammond." "There's no confusion," Eliza said, her voice tight. "I am Jacob's legal guardian. My brother made his wishes perfectly clear." Ah, but that's where the complication arises, Reynolds countered smoothly. You see, the company provided certain benefits to its employees and their families, insurance, if you will. In the event of Thomas Hammond's death, there are provisions for his heir. Jacob, Thomas Henderson interjected gruffly. Precisely, Reynolds nodded. A not insubstantial trust has been established in the boy's name. However, to access these funds, his legal guardian must be officially recognized by the company and the territorial court. I have documents, Eliza began, but Reynolds raised a hand to stop her. Personal letters and verbal statements are unfortunately insufficient in legal terms, Miss Hammond. The company requires formal guardianship papers, properly filed and approved by a judge. The implication hung in the air, heavy and threatening. Eliza's guardianship of Jacob, assumed and unquestioned until now, might not be as secure as they had believed. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Reynolds? Zeke asked, keeping his tone even with effort. Reynolds spread his hands in a gesture of apparent reasonableness. Merely that Miss Hammond should formalize her guardianship through proper legal channels. The company's interest is simply ensuring that young Jacob's inheritance is properly managed until he comes of age. And if these papers aren't filed, Margaret asked sharply, a shadow crossed Reynolds's face. Then the company would be obligated to petition the court for appointment of a suitable guardian who could meet the legal requirements. He glanced meaningfully around the modest Henderson home. The court naturally considers the child's best interests, including financial stability and proper upbringing. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Without legal recognition of her guardianship, Eliza might lose Jacob to someone the mining company or the court deemed more suitable. How much time do we have? Thomas Henderson asked, his weathered face set in grim lines. The company's board meets in Helena in 3 weeks, Reynolds replied. It would be advantageous for Miss Hammond to have her affairs in order by then. He rose, retrieving his hat from the side table. I'll be staying at the hotel in town for 2 days should you have any questions. Good day to you all. The tension in the room broke only when the sound of hoofbeats confirmed Reynolds's departure. Eliza's composure crumbled, tears streaming down her face as she clutched Jacob to her chest. They can't take him, she whispered brokenly. They can't. They won't, Zeke said with a conviction that surprised even himself, kneeling before her and taking her cold hands in his. I promise you, Eliza, they won't take Jacob from you. The fear in her eyes cut him to the quick. How can you be sure? I have no money for lawyers, no influence with judges. I'm just a seamstress, barely 20 years old. But you're not alone, Zeke reminded her gently. You have your aunt and uncle, you have the support of people in this town. He squeezed her hands. And you have me. That evening, after Jacob had been put to bed and Margaret had tactfully left them alone in the parlor, Zeke and Eliza discussed their options. Thomas had ridden to fetch Sheriff Miller, who, though not a lawyer, had experience with territorial law and might offer guidance. Reynolds is right about one thing, the sheriff confirmed grimly when he arrived. Without formal guardianship papers recognized by the territorial court, Eliza's position is precarious at best. What would it take to obtain such papers? Zeke asked. Sheriff Miller rubbed his graying beard thoughtfully. Judge Harrington circuits through Clearwater Springs every 2 months. He's due next week, as luck would have it, but he'll want evidence that Eliza can provide properly for the boy, financially, I mean. He glanced apologetically at Eliza. Working at the mercantile is respectable enough, but the wages. I've been saving, Eliza said defensively, and I've taken in extra sewing work, between that and what Uncle Thomas and Aunt Margaret contribute. It might not be enough, Sheriff Miller interrupted gently. Not against the resources of a mining company that wants to control the boy's inheritance. A heavy silence fell over the room as the reality of their situation sank in. Eliza's hands twisted in her lap, her face a study in barely contained desperation. What if she weren't alone? Zeke heard himself say, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the thought. What if there were another means of securing her guardianship? All eyes turned to him, questioning. A married woman, Zeke continued, his heart pounding in his chest, with a husband of means, with property and a stable income, she would be viewed differently by the court, wouldn't she? Sheriff Miller's eyebrows rose toward his hairline. Well, yes, considerably so. Zeke turned to face Eliza directly, taking her hands in his. This isn't how I planned to ask, he said softly. Not with an audience and certainly not under these circumstances. But I love you, Eliza Hammond. I think I have since I first saw you struggling through that snowstorm, protecting Jacob with everything you had. Eliza's eyes widened, tears gathering at the corners. Oh, Zeke. Let me finish, he said gently. I love you, and I love that boy as if he were my own flesh and blood. I've watched you with him, seen the way you're building a life here despite everything you've lost. I admire your courage, your determination, your gentle heart. He took a deep breath. I was going to wait to court you properly for a full year before asking, but if marriage now would help secure Jacob's future with you, then I'm asking now. Will you marry me, Eliza? Tears spilled onto Eliza's cheeks. You would do that, marry me now because of Jacob. Not because of Jacob, Zeke corrected firmly. Because I love you and I want to spend my life with you both. Jacob's situation merely changes the timing, not the intention. But your life, your ranch, will be all the better for having you and Jacob in it, Zeke insisted. The Circle Z is large enough for a family, it always was. I just didn't know I wanted one until I met you. Eliza searched his face, perhaps looking for doubt or hesitation. Finding none, she squeezed his hands tightly. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat loudly, reminding them they weren't alone. Well, that's settled then. I'll speak to Reverend Collins tonight. No reason you can't be married before Judge Harrington arrives next week. Later, after the sheriff had departed and Thomas and Margaret had tactfully retired for the evening, Zeke and Eliza sat together on the porch swing. The spring night cool but not uncomfortable. Are you certain about this? Eliza asked softly. Marriage is an enormous step, Zeke. I don't want you to regret. I won't, Zeke interrupted, drawing her closer to his side. I've thought about this more than you know, Eliza. Not the timing, perhaps, but the outcome. You and Jacob becoming my family. He smiled down at her. The only thing I regret is not having a proper ring to give you tonight. I don't need a ring, Eliza assured him, resting her head against his shoulder. Just your word. You have that, Zeke promised, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, and my heart besides. They were married 3 days later in the small church on Pine Street, with half the town in attendance despite the hasty arrangements. Margaret had worked tirelessly to alter one of her own good dresses for Eliza, a simple but elegant creation of pale blue silk that brought out the gold in her hair and the warmth in her hazel eyes. Zeke, for his part, wore his best suit, freshly pressed, with a new shirt purchased from Mrs. Patterson's mercantile. Jacob, beaming with importance, carried the rings on a small pillow, only slightly distracted by the shiny objects in his care. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, Reverend Collins emphasizing not the haste of their union, but the commitment it represented, to each other, to Jacob, to building a life together on the frontier where such bonds were all the more precious for their rarity. As Zeke slipped the simple gold band onto Eliza's finger, a family heirloom Margaret had insisted she take, he felt a sense of rightness that transcended the circumstances that had precipitated their wedding. This wasn't a marriage of convenience or necessity, despite what some in town might whisper. It was the natural culmination of what had been growing between them since that snowy day in December. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Collins declared, beaming at the couple. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Zimmerman. Zeke drew Eliza close, his hands gentle on her waist as he bent to press his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, respectful of their surroundings, but carried a promise of deeper passion to come. When they parted, the cheers and applause of their neighbors filled the small church, Jacob's excited clapping louder than all the rest. The celebration continued at the Henderson home, where Margaret had prepared a wedding feast that belied the short notice. The parlor and dining room overflowed with well-wishers, many bringing small gifts or dishes to share. Mrs. Patterson presented Eliza with a bolt of fine wool fabric for your new home. Sheriff Miller offered a bottle of good whiskey for those cold Montana nights. Even old Jenkins, whose cabin had sheltered them during the blizzard, appeared with a hand-carved wooden box for Eliza's sewing supplies. Through it all, Zeke found himself watching his new wife with a sense of wonder. Eliza moved among their guests with natural grace, Jacob perched on her hip or clinging to her skirts, both of them now legally and irrevocably his family. His family, the concept still felt foreign, almost dizzying in its implications. After years of solitude, of believing himself destined to walk alone, Zeke Zimmerman had a wife and son. Not by blood in Jacob's case, but by choice, a bond he was beginning to understand could be even stronger. As the evening wore on and guests began to depart, Zeke found Margaret at his elbow, her eyes misty with emotion. You'll take good care of them, she said. It wasn't a question but a statement of absolute faith. With everything I have, Zeke promised. Margaret patted his arm approvingly. I knew from the moment you brought them to our door that you were a good man, Zeke Zimmerman, but I didn't know then how perfect you would be for our Eliza. She glanced across the room to where Eliza was saying goodbye to the last of their guests, Jacob now fast asleep on Thomas's shoulder. She's stronger than she looks, that girl, had to be after losing so much, but even the strongest need someone to lean on sometimes. I'll be that for her, Zeke said simply, for both of them. When the last guest had departed and Jacob had been settled in his bed for the night, Margaret showed Zeke and Eliza to the guest room that had been prepared for their wedding night. The older woman embraced Eliza tightly, whispering something in her ear that brought a blush to the young bride's cheeks, before bidding them both good night with a knowing smile. Alone at last, Zeke turned to find Eliza standing by the window, bathed in moonlight, more beautiful than he had ever seen her. The enormity of the day of their commitment to each other seemed to hang in the air between them, at once thrilling and terrifying. Are you happy? He asked softly, crossing the room to stand before her. Eliza looked up at him, her eyes luminous in the dim light. Happier than I ever thought possible, she admitted. When I set out from Helena with Jacob, I was so afraid. For him, for myself, for our future. I never imagined that something as terrible as being stranded in that blizzard could lead to something as wonderful as finding you. Zeke raised a hand to cup her cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin beneath his calloused palm. I think perhaps we found each other, he murmured, two lost souls in a snowstorm. Not lost anymore, Eliza whispered, turning her face to press a kiss to his palm. The simple gesture ignited something in Zeke that had been banked since their first kiss in the church. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his mouth to hers. This kiss was different from their chaste exchange at the altar, deeper, more honest in its desire. Eliza responded with a passion that matched his own, her arms sliding around his neck as she pressed herself against him. Zeke groaned softly, his hands spanning her waist, feeling the delicate structure of her beneath layers of wedding finery. I love you, he breathed against her lips. My wife. My husband, Eliza returned, the words holding a note of wonder. I love you too, so much. What followed was a night of tender discovery, of whispered endearments and gentle guidance as they learned each other's bodies with the same care they had taken in learning each other's hearts. Zeke, mindful of Eliza's innocence, proceeded with exquisite patience, his focus entirely on her comfort and pleasure. Eliza, for her part, approached their union with the same quiet determination she brought to all aspects of her life, her trust in him evident in every touch, every sigh. When they finally came together completely, Zeke felt something fundamental shift within him, as though a piece long missing had finally clicked into place, making him whole in a way he hadn't known was possible. In Eliza's arms, surrounded by her warmth and trust, the last of his carefully constructed walls crumbled to dust. He had spent years believing that love was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford, that connections only led to pain. Now holding his wife as she drifted toward sleep against his chest, Zeke understood how wrong he had been. Love wasn't weakness, it was strength, it was purpose, it was coming home after years of wandering. And in the snowbound hearts of a young woman and the orphaned child she fought so fiercely to protect, Zeke Zimmerman had found his home at last.